Trying to picture what it must have been like on VE Day, celebrated in much of the world today in history in 1945, it's all too easy to fall back on tropes of street parties, sing-alongs, and nurses being kissed by sailors. But while it was indeed a day of jubilation for many, VE Day was actually a complicated affair for wartime Britain, both logistically and emotionally.
Yeah, and that complexity began even before the beginning of VE Day, because the actual getting to the moment of Winston Churchill making his famous address where he talks about the signing of the Act of Unconditional Surrender of all German land, sea and air forces in Europe actually came about through this incredibly tortured 20-hour process, because with Hitler dead and the Nazi regime crumbling, the war in Europe was all but over. But at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF in Reims, the British Secretary Susan Hibbert had worked for 20 hours to finalise the surrender documents, and only after this incredibly long process did they arrive at what actually became an incredibly stark sentence from the weirdly understated General Dwight Eisenhower, who wasn't there himself, but also decided that he wanted his message that he was sending out to be incredibly stark and simple. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7th, 1945. That was the end of the war.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at the footage of them all in Reims signing the documents, negotiating peace on this war that had raged for 6 years. It's not the joy that you associate with VE Day because Britain and the Allies were the victors, so when we see the footage of it, we see people partying in Piccadilly Circus, as you alluded to. It is actually this really sort of sombre military occasion where everyone looks very serious, but you know, you have to bear in mind, obviously, they knew that this wasn't really the end of the war. It wasn't the end of the war in Japan. That was still going on for another 3 months after this. And there's the question of, like, what happens next? Like, and of course, that was right, that concern, because what happened after VE Day involved, you know, huge amounts of migrants traversing across Europe, you know, people, particularly with German accents, all over the world being persecuted for years afterwards, Germany as a country being completely ruined and having to be divided up and revivified and all the rest of it. So it's right that they were serious, but of course, when we think of today in history and we think of VE Day, victory in Europe, you think of those parties in the streets. And what's interesting to me is looking back at the newspaper front pages from Today in History in 1945. I'd always been taught that it was a kind of spontaneous event. You know, everyone kind of getting drunk and conga lines and homemade fireworks and mad celebrations. But it obviously wasn't, because you read the front of the Daily Express and it's reporting what happened last night, which is people were responding to the fact they knew the war was over before Churchill had announced it. There'd already been like 36 hours of so-called spontaneous piss-up by this point.
Yeah.
Yeah, the plans had actually been in the works for a long time. In fact, the term VE Day actually predates the day itself by almost a year. It was first used in September 1944 when it became clear that the D-Day invasion had been a success and that Allied victory was starting to look inevitable. But there had been a Whitehall committee that had been planning how the country was going to react to hopefully the news of victory for some time. The original plans were to call it Ceasefire Day, but Churchill pointed out that, you know, it should be renamed mindfully of the ongoing conflict in the East. And so this same preparation committee, I've got to say, they dropped the ball on a few things. I mean, the name idea wasn't great. They also wanted to mark the day by having air raid sirens across the country blast a 3-minute all clear signal. Wisely, this was also
that'll cheer everyone up, a traumatized nation.
Yeah, extremely traumatic. But as you mentioned, in the event, you know, the celebrations broke out as soon as the news of the surrender was reported on the 7th of May, with the impromptu street parties and pubs opening late into the night. But those more formal celebrations the next day had already been drawn up. And in fact, one of Churchill's first orders of business when the 8th of May finally dawned was to check there was enough beer in London's pubs, and he was assured that they could indeed cope.
Yeah, the Home Office actually issued a circular instructing the nation how they could celebrate. They said bonfires will be allowed, but the government trusts that only material with no salvage value will be used. The Board of Trade did a similar thing. They said until the end of May you may buy cotton bunting without coupons as long as it's red, white or blue and does not cost more than 1 shilling and 3 pence a square yard. So they were already gearing people up for a big party. What sort of astonished me was, you know, that there's reports of 1 million people hitting the streets in London, but London's population was 8 million people. I was thinking about all those people who were like, Yeah, I might just skip it, actually. I'm going to stay in.
Just have a glass of juice in the Anderson shelter. That'll do me.
I can't stand those VE Day crowds.
I mean, of course, it must have been a tremendous release, particularly for young people. But at the same time, it is a traumatised nation, isn't it? And the little things would have made a real difference. I mean, it really hits me emotionally when you hear people describe, because obviously this was recently enough that, you know, there's audio testimony you can hear of what it was like being a child or a teenager in this environment. People recall that they heard church bells for the first time since 1940. I mean, imagine living in an English village and you haven't heard the church bells for 5 years. And that was because they were only supposed to be rung in the event of an invasion. Imagine what it would feel like to hear that on this day, that things were being lit up after years of blackout and you had the searchlights pointing at St. Paul's, making the V sign. Even little things like there was a weather forecast in the newspapers and on the BBC because they hadn't wanted the enemy to know what the weather was. I mean, just those little changes would have been enough, wouldn't they? Yeah. You wouldn't have to get down to Piccadilly Circus, would you? You could have a party anywhere.
Yeah, and you mentioned the churches. So Thanksgiving services were a huge part of the celebration of VE Day. And St. Paul's Cathedral held services back to back, 10 in all, to accommodate the thousands of people who wanted to attend. Precisely for that same reason, I think our minds tend to go to parties, but there were a lot of people for whom VE Day was kind of a poignant day. You know, people who had lost loved ones or had loved ones who were still serving at the front. You know, this was a day when they maybe wanted to just have a moment of quiet as well. They didn't want to just celebrate all day because there was still real danger and there was still a lot of loss.
Yeah, another person who didn't want to celebrate immediately was the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, who was displeased upon learning of the surrender ceremony in Reims, and he claimed that the Soviet representative Ivan Susluparov had signed without authorization and that the document's wording was different from an earlier agreement that he had approved. And so because he wanted to assert Soviet control, he rejected the surrender that had been signed on French soil, which immediately created confusion. German radio reported that while the Axis had surrendered to the Western Allies, they remained at war with the Soviets, and fighting did then persist to May 8th. And to resolve the dispute, another ceremony, like surrender ceremony, was hastily arranged in Soviet-occupied Berlin, and it took place just before midnight early on May 9th in Moscow. So as a result, while most of the world marks VE Day on May 8th, Russia and its former republics celebrate Victory Day on May the 9th.
Yeah, so Churchill made his announcement at 3 p.m. today in history itself to try and coordinate with the Americans and the French, because that's what Truman and Charles de Gaulle were doing in their respective nations as well, announcing to the people at that exact time. Even though this is a world of not worldwide broadcasts, so you'd only hear your local leader, but still they didn't want the news travelling till it was officially announced in all three countries at once. But yeah, of course, you know, Russia was an ally, and it's funny to think, looked at from this perspective in the 21st century, that on this day in history you could buy a Stalin flag in London. You know, you could get a mug for victory which had Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin on it. That was the merch they were cranking out. But this was the feeling. People were very grateful to all the leaders, including, of course, Churchill, and he was the centrepiece of the event. Well, aside from maybe the royals, we'll get to them in a minute. And he too, I mean, not to Stalin levels, sure, but he too also kind of seemed strangely underwhelmed, I think, at the outbreak of peace. You know, considering that he was the figurehead of it and he was the person the public were clamouring to see and speak. He did later, after the war, talk about this as an anticlimax. And you do sort of weirdly get that sense, even from this momentous speech he gives at 3 p.m. on VE Day, that he knows this is the last important speech he's going to give. And for him, that's kind of personally sad.
Yeah, and there was kind of a similar feeling in the United States as well, because the official celebrations there were quite muted by the fact that they were missing their Winston Churchill. You know, Franklin D. Roosevelt had led the US through the war. He died in office from a brain hemorrhage just 3 weeks earlier, and flags were still at half-mast because the protocol for a president's death was 30 days of mourning, and they stayed that way. You know, they weren't going to interrupt the protocol for VE Day, and it was interim President Harry S. Truman's 61st birthday as well. So he was having a very odd period of time in a very short period. So he was also mindful in his reaction. You know, he dedicated the victory to Roosevelt. He kind of took a bit of a back step. You know, he later said, you know, it was the happiest day of his life, but there was a feeling that he couldn't be too jubilant in public while America was still mourning its leader. Although, of course, you know, in the streets, the USA, Roosevelt's death didn't inhibit the revelry.
And then, of course, for people around the world who would see this on newsreels later, the coverage was as important as the event itself. there are lots of fascinating kind of visual moments from the day. Churchill wearing his siren suit, which is like a onesie, basically, inspired by bricklayer boiler suits, which he had tailor-made for him by Turnbull and Asser, which he was known to put on swiftly during air raids. That was the point, was like he'd get photographed with politicians wearing his boiler suit. I'm working, it's a war. He wore that with his trademark black hat, which is an incredible combination. But we only know all of these images because the BBC were there, because at the very last minute, like early this morning, I believe, they'd headed down to Denham Studios where they were filming Brief Encounter. I'm not making this up. And they took one of the few cameras which could record in colour from Denham Studios back to Buckingham Palace to get this scene of the royals on the balcony.
The king and his two daughters, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, they appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace 8 times, just being brought back for more and more encores. But the fun bit, and most people do know this story, but it's still so fun that it's worth mentioning, is that in this unprecedented and spontaneous breach of protocol, Elizabeth and Margaret slipped out, accompanied by 2 guard officers. But in the darkness of the night, they were able to kind of blend into the crowds. And Elizabeth later recalled that we stood outside and shouted, "We want the king." She said, "I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life." And it must have been so great. And I think the celebrations in general would have been incredible that day, because just everything would have suddenly been different and new and forward-thinking.
Yeah, and the celebration of VE Day was kind of a complicated subject for the British Commonwealth, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, which obviously are quite far ahead of European time. So when the surrender document went into effect late on the night of the 7th, that was already mid-morning in Australia. And it was decided that Australia, was going to take the plunge. They were going to celebrate a bit preemptively. So on the 8th of May, people got involved in quite spontaneous celebrations. But in New Zealand, it was difficult because they were another 2 hours ahead of European time. So it was decided that New Zealand would celebrate on the 9th of May, while Australia was partying on the 8th. They would hold it in until the official announcement was made. This led to a situation where New Zealanders woke up on the 8th of May, saw on the headlines of all of the morning papers that the war in Europe was over, and still had to just go to work as normal and hold in their revelry for the next day.
There's quite a lot about the national character of those two countries, that one managed to hold itself together and one went straight down to the pub.
Well, they didn't have any bunting, you see.
That's right, yeah.
Here we were preoccupied with making our bunting and our mock banana. You see that? People celebrated by mushing together parsnips. That's what they had to eat.
We had that when we were at school, which obviously was not during the 1940s. We had to go and do an evacuee experience, and I remember distinctly that they prepared us mashed parsnip sandwiches with banana flavouring on them, and we were all forced to eat them.
Yeah, horrendous. Yeah. But obviously, after 6 years of war, you'd feel differently, wouldn't you?
Probably tastes pretty good.
The taste of freedom. Yes.
Yeah. Freedom banana.
To hear more from us on this topic, join Club Retrospectors now. Unlock our weekly bonus bits at patreon.com/retrospectors.